Hi everybody. Welcome to Daf Yomi Week in Review. Boy, Sanhedrin has been such an interesting track date, hasn't it? I'm Rachel Scheinerman. I edit My Jewish Learning and a Daily Dose of Talmud, and I'm happy to welcome you today to our Daf Yomi Week in Review, where we invite a rotating crew of wonderful teachers to zoom through some interesting things we saw in our journey through the Daf in the last 7 days. And this morning, we are joined by Dr. Sarah Ronas.
Good morning, everyone. It is lovely to see some regular faces. I'm also seeing some new faces. So if you are joining us today for the first or time or the 50th time, let us know in the chat where you're joining us from. Especially if you're new, if you tell us, lots of people in this community are excited to welcome you. So we have done a lot this week. This week, I think building on what Dr. Scheinerman just said, Sanhedrin is really wrestling with some questions that are still very live for us today. Issues of liability, issues of justice that I think we still think a lot about. So we started out this week with a discussion of those who can be killed in order to prevent them from hurting someone else, which are called the laws of Rodef. We had a discussion of whether you can use maximum lethal force or whether we have to calibrate minimum lethal force to stop someone from hurting someone else. Then we talked about what kinds of prohibitions are permitted in a time of mortal danger, right? These are often translated as the cardinal sins, or hareg ve'al ya'avor, those that you should be killed rather than transgress. And we discussed that the three cardinal sins are idol worship, forbidden sexual relations, and murder. And we're going to come back to that a little bit later this morning. We talked about whether we can save a man's life at the expense of a woman's body, right? That fabulous feminist rant on Sanhedrin 75 about whether a woman should be obligated to engage sexually with a man in order to save his life. Spoiler alert, the Talmud says absolutely not. And that's how we ended the 8th chapter of Sanhedrin. And then we started the 9th chapter, and we talked about people who are liable for stoning and for engaging with forbidden sexual activity. We talked about people who are liable for decapitation, murderers, and people who live in an idolatrous city. And we began to talk about what kinds of murder are considered what we would today probably call first-degree murder, right? Whether one is liable for murdering someone who is actively dying already, what happens if someone strikes a killing blow, but the victim recovers slightly, but then declines again, and then dies, right? Are they responsible for the death, or because the person had begun to recover, the eventual decline is related to something else? And then we had a really interesting discussion that sort of highlighted for us the beginnings of a carceral system, right? The beginnings of a system where we jail people for a period of time, with our discussion of, do we hold someone who has committed an act of violence in some kind of detention while we wait to see if the victim dies? Right? So some really interesting questions that we were talking about this week. Now, in our brief time together, I really want to go back to this discussion of the cardinal sins. And if we have time, I'd love to spend some time thinking with you about what you found most interesting. So please drop in the chat what you were most excited about in today's DAF. So let me share a handout with you. Now, those of you who are new, I'm going to put the link in the chat for those who like to have it open for themselves, but I'm also going to share my screen so that you don't have to open up another window if you don't want to. Let's make this as easy as possible. All right. So we started out, can everybody see? Thumbs up from somebody? Yes, thank you. We started out our discussion of the cardinal sins by naming 3 things that you are absolutely not allowed to do. And if somebody says to you, do that or I will kill you, you're supposed to say, well, then I guess you're going to have to kill me. Now, that's a really interesting discussion because it sounds very black and white. And then we get a couple of really interesting nuances on what that might actually mean. So let's look at this. This is from Bavli Sanhedrin 74a and b. When Rav Dimi came from the land of Israel to Babylonia, right? And Rav Dimi, let's remind ourselves, Rav Dimi is one of the traveling rabbis who is seen as traveling between Roman Palestine and Sasanian Babylonia in order to in order to well, for lots of reasons, but one of the things that he does is he transmits traditions from one community to the other, right? In his travels, he learns with rabbis in the land of Israel, and then he transmits those traditions to Babylonia. So when Rav Dimi came from the land of Israel to Babylonia, he said that Rabbi Yochanan said, the sages taught these three cardinal sins are the only things that you should agree to be killed rather than do, are only when it is not a time of persecution. But in a time of persecution, even a minor mitzvah, one must be killed and not transgress. Okay, so Rav Dimi explains that Rabbi Yochanan, who's one of the key sages, is Rabbi Yochanan in the land of Israel, right? We've met him many times, and that he says in a time where the government is stable, you're good. Those three sins are the only things that you're supposed to say, nope, you're going to have to kill me instead of doing. But if we're in a moment of structural government persecution, right? If the government is persecuting, and in the context of the Talmud, I think we're supposed to read this as the government is specifically persecuting Jews for being Jews, then if the government even says transgress this minor mitzvah, you're supposed to say absolutely not. In this moment of sort of heightened danger around being Jewish, everything about being Jewish is a little bit more fraught. So I'm curious what we think about that. Let's open it up. If anyone wants to put something in the chat, responses, questions, thoughts to just this little piece so far. Or you can raise your hand and we can find you and unmute you. And by we, I mean Dr. Scheinerman. So Aaron asks, does this only apply when you are coerced into the cardinal sins? Yes. So we're talking here about a case where you might imagine somebody comes to you and says, you must transgress a sin or else, a mitzvah, or else you will be killed. We might think here about the famous Hanukkah story, and in the books of Maccabees, we hear that the Seleucid army was going from town to town and basically forcing people to worship idols at the point of a sword, right? So thinking really about coercion, absolutely. And we might say, well, worship idols, okay, but what if they came to me and said, you got to eat that bacon cheeseburger or else we'll kill you, right? Okay, so idolatry we know is not okay, but could you say, all right, so I'm going to have a bite of that bacon cheeseburger, right? Those of us who observe traditional kosher laws. And the Rabbi Yochanan seems to be saying, in a time of persecution, we're supposed to even say, no, I'm not even going to eat that bacon cheeseburger. You're going to have to kill me. Now, Betsy asks, why not fight back? And I think that's a really great question. So we're going to come back to it, right? Don't let me lose that piece of this puzzle. All right. And I appreciate Deborah is asking, right? Deborah is asking, well, what does this mean in other periods in history? So Deborah asks, does this mean that crypto Jews and conversos who were already baptized should not go to church instead of die? Right? Really thinking about what does this actually look like in specific contexts? All right, so let's look at the next piece of this story, and then we're going to keep building it out. When Ravin came, Ravin is another one of our traveling rabbis. Whenever you say when X came, it means when they came from the land of Israel to Babylonia. So when Ravin came, he shared that Rabbi Yochanan said, even when it's not a time of persecution, the sages said you can only agree to transgress a sin in private. But in public, not even a minor mitzvah, he must be killed and not transgress. Right? When Rabin came, right now we're saying, even if you're in a time of peace, and I see people in the chat trying to figure out when those times might be, even if you're in a time of peace, you're only allowed to transgress a mitzvah rather than die in private. But if it happens in a public context, and for the Talmud, they're going to describe that as 10 um, as 10 uh, probably adult Jewish men, but it says 10 men. Um, right, in public, you're not even allowed to transgress a minor mitzvah, even in a time of peace. Now, of course, the Talmud's going to ask the question that I'd want to know in this case, right, which is, what is a minor mitzvah? Rava Bar Yitzchak says that Rav says even to change the strap of a sandal, right? Apparently, I didn't know this, but maybe you all did. Jews have very distinctive taste in shoes, and even changing your shoe laces is a minor enough mitzvah to that you're not allowed to do it. Okay, so far we've seen these traditions from the land of Israel, right, which really limit the function, right? They limit the ability to say, I'm going to transgress a mitzvah rather than um, right, I'm going to transgress a mitzvah rather than be killed, right? So the original tradition says there's only three things you can't transgress in order to save your life. And they're pretty big deals, right? Murdering somebody else, worshiping idols, and forbidden sexual relations. And then we have these two traditions which say, but it depends of it depends whether or not you're in a time of sustained government persecution, and it depends whether you're in public or private. So these limit, right? These limit those exceptions. Now we're going to get a little bit of a different take on this. And this is Rava. Rava says their personal pleasure is different, right? Their personal pleasure is different. So Rava's distinguishing between two different kinds of do this or I'll kill you. All right. One kind of do this or I'll kill you is is because it's gonna make me happy, right? I am going to enjoy this thing, right? What might an example of that be? So the Talmud gives two examples. One is an example of uh, Esther and Achashverosh, right? Esther and Ahasuerus. Ahasuerus wants to have intimate marital relations with Esther. Esther should not be having, right? These are, in theory, forbidden sexual relations for the rabbis because they think Esther is married to somebody else already. But he's not doing it to say, I hate Jews and I'm trying to show you that Jews are immoral. Achashverosh wants to be intimate with Esther because it will bring him, in the words of Rava, personal pleasure, right? So he's not making a theological statement. He's just trying to enjoy himself at the expense of somebody else. The other example that the rabbis give here is, one who says, "I really just want you to cut my grass on Shabbat, right? I want you to desecrate Shabbat and cut my grass because I really am tired of having, a really tall grass, and I'm getting letters from the HOA. So, at gunpoint, cut my grass." Again, not making a statement about theology, just forcing someone to do their will because it will personally benefit them. Their personal pleasure is different. That's different from saying, I'm trying to make a statement that Jews are bad or that I have power over Jews or that, my religion is better than Judaism, right? That's a different thing. But if I'm doing this because it's going to benefit me in some way to force you to do a thing, then Rava says you're allowed to do it. And then he gives this fascinating example. Rava says, and if you don't say that their personal pleasure is different, then how is it that we give them coal shovels? Right? Great question. If you know what we're talking about here. If you don't, this is very confusing. So, what Rava's describing, right? So, here I think it's worth reminding ourselves that Rava is living in Sasanian Babylonia. And um, right, Rava is living in Sasanian Babylonia. The majority religion in Sasanian Babylonia is Zoroastrianism. Zoroastrianism, important religion in Iran today. Still, many Zoroastrian communities, especially those of you who live on the west coast of the US, there is a large Zoroastrian population there. And Zoroastrian religious tradition involves altars on which fire is burned, right? So, fire altars. And these fire altars, apparently, in the time of the Talmud, before, whether it's major holidays or whether it's once a year, they would go around to everyone's house in the empire and collect a shovel worth of coal that they were going to use for the year to burn on their fire altars. Now, Zoroastrians are not worshiping the God of Israel, right? They are not worshiping the Jewish God. They are worshiping their own God, Ahura Mazda or Ormazd. And so they are absolutely worshiping a different god with this coal, right? This is not a we can't like pretend it's a right. We respect difference here, right? Or I respect difference here. So they are absolutely worshiping a different god. And apparently Rava tells us that the Jewish community, right, everybody would give them a shovel of coal when they would come around to collect. Now, if this is idolatry, this should be one of the cardinal sins. And yet he says, no, it's absolutely permitted, right? Because they're not doing it to make a point about Judaism. They're doing it because it makes them happy, right? Personal pleasure is different. Now, I'm seeing a lot of people ask in the chat, what is going on with these completely different takes, right? Absolutely. What is going on with these very different takes? These first two are trying to figure out why, um, you know, here's our list of three, but when should we actually be killed for even more things than that? And then Rava is insisting, actually, even something that you might think is idolatry really isn't if it's for their personal pleasure and not in order to make a statement about Judaism, right? I mean, the rabbis are not worshiping idols. Let me be extremely clear about that. But even something that would contribute to someone else worshiping a god that's not the Jewish God, he says actually it's fine if it's for their personal pleasure. Now, what do we make of this difference? Here is where I want to go back to something that a couple of folks have already been thinking about in the chat, right? And that is context. I think the context here really matters. So when we look at the traditions that Rav Dimi and Rava and Ravin bring us from the land of Israel, right? Those are from the Roman Palestine, right? From this Roman province, the Roman Empire. If you've seen Life of Brian or have ever observed Tisha B'Av, the Roman Empire is an empire in which Jews, specifically the rabbis, describe themselves being persecuted a lot, right? It seems as though there are sustained periods of persecution aimed at Jews specifically, right? Or aimed at Jews and other religious minorities specifically. That becomes more prevalent once the Roman Empire Christianizes in the 4th century. But even in the time of Rav Dimi and Rabbi Yochanan, right, in much earlier, we do have the memory of the destruction of the temple. We have the putting down of the Bar Kokhba revolt, right? There is a real sense that this is an empire which is opposed not just to Jews, but to Judaism, right? Not just to I don't like everybody, so maybe there's some Jews I don't like, but they have a real problem with Judaism per se. Now, Rava doesn't live in Roman Palestine. Rava lives in Sasanian Babylonia. And one of the things that we know from reading the Talmud consistently, those of us who've been doing this, is that Sasanian Babylonia doesn't have a sustained history of persecution of Jews. That in fact, the Sasanian emperor or Shah has a pretty decent relationship with at least some Jews. And in general, as long as everybody, doesn't revolt against the empire, is pretty cool with everyone doing their own thing. And so, and maybe that comes from the fact that Roman religion and then Christianity wanted everyone to worship the same gods, whereas Zoroastrianism actually doesn't have a huge concept of conversion, right? They weren't looking to get people to be like them, so they wanted people to be more, um, they wanted folks to be, you know, well behaved and peaceful, but not necessarily all worship their god. But Rava lives in a place where largely he's not experiencing religious persecution for being Jewish. And I think part of what we're seeing here then is in a time when you are being persecuted structurally as a Jew, everything is fraught, right? Even changing your shoelace in some way is a public statement. And in a time where you are living in relative peace and where problems that arise mostly for the rabbis have to do with taxation, and it's less about being Jewish and it's more about tax structures, you can actually go along to get along an awful lot more, right? Now, the challenge, I think, for us, right? I think the challenge for us is that how do we know which one we're in, right? I'm seeing people in the chat point to particularly famous moments where it was clear Jews were being persecuted as Jews, right? The Holocaust, the Spanish Inquisition, right? These are obvious moments where Jews were being persecuted as Jews. But how do we know the rest of the time what we can go along to get along, right? Now, do I mean if somebody ever comes to you and says, murder somebody else or I'll kill you, it's okay? No, absolutely not. Do not quote me on that. But what about ways where we, you know, here's an example, right? Can you wish somebody on December 25th a Merry Christmas? Right. Right. Are we in a time of peace where, supporting other people's religious beliefs doesn't really affect us or say anything about Judaism? Or are we in a time where everything is so fraught that that should be forbidden? I don't think the Talmud gives us an answer on how to determine when we're in which one. But to me, when we look at these, and we don't just look at the words of the text, but we try to understand the geographic context, right? The historical context, who's saying what, when, and where, we have a better understanding, right? They're not being inconsistent, right? They're actually being hugely consistent based on their own lived experiences. And the challenge that I think we have is to figure out which of those are we in. Now, the joke is if you remember Crazy Ex-Girlfriend, right? Remember that we suffered, right? That perhaps we're always in a time of religious persecution as Jews. I think that for the Talmud, that's not the answer because they don't actually see themselves in Babylonia as being in a time of religious persecution when some of us looking back might say, I don't know, things weren't that great. But is it a sustained and intentional religious persecution? That's a question that the Talmud doesn't really offer us an answer for. And so I don't have an answer for it, but I think this really challenges us to think carefully about our own context, right? How do we know which kind of context we're in, and how should that shape how we are acting? Um, Dr. Scheineman, we have about 4 minutes left, and I'm curious, maybe we can get some reactions, but I'd also, if anyone has a question that you want to raise that I missed in the chat, um, either of those we have some time for.
Folks, feel free to raise your hand if you want to ask a question out loud. I think there's a general anxiety of like, really, we're going to punish people for minor transgressions, davka, when it's a time of persecution. Like I remember thinking that when I encountered it. I thought it was going to be we have more permission to transgress in a time of
Mm.
persecution um, to avoid further suffering, right? Like because and so that was interesting. And I think some folks picked up on that in the chat too.
Absolutely. And what's really interesting to me is if we look at responsa from the Holocaust. So many years ago, I worked on a project gathering responsa, rabbinic responsa about the Holocaust, written during the Holocaust, right? People in ghettos asking a rabbi what to do if they can't get kosher meat. People in awaiting deportations, asking, right, in a very famous responsa, I have a chance to get my son off the list, but they need a certain number of people to go, right? They are expecting 100 people to get on this train. I can bribe an official and pull my son off the list, but then somebody else is going to get put on that list who wasn't there already. Can I pull my son off the train? Right? That kind of question. Heartbreaking questions, right? And the first time I read these, my response was, well, maybe not the son on the train one, but certainly the kosher meat one was like, eat the meat. You're starving. Why are you doing? What are you even doing? Right? You're in a ghetto. You don't know this yet, but you're about to be murdered. Get the nutrition you need to be healthy. And a dear friend pointed out to me that when what is at stake is you as a Jew continuing to care about Jewish tradition is its own form of resistance, right? That there are lots of ways to resist religious persecution. Some of them, maybe folks are mentioning in the chat, involve picking up a sword. I'm not saying those aren't, but I'm saying there are lots of ways that people understood themselves to be resisting and to be living meaningful lives in a world where people were trying to shut that down. And, you know, on the one hand, I feel like I would eat the meat. And on the other hand, I don't know, in a situation where what is at stake is my very Jewishness, to say, well, then okay, I guess I'm not going to be Jewish the way I want to be Jewish. That's a complicated question. And I don't, thank God I am not in a position where I can judge how other people have made that decision, right? Because I've never been there. And I mean that like really gratefully, that we can look at this from the distance of time and not have our own personal experiences to bring to bear. So I want to name that, right? I agree. I think that is a really complicated question. And I don't know that I have an answer. I think what we're seeing is, in the face of persecution by huge empires, right? We're not talking, I just need to find the guy and change his mind, right? The Roman Empire, right, as a whole, which is huge. How do I choose to live a meaningful Jewish life in the face where I can't change the system? I think we're seeing how some rabbis thought about it, um, and that is an important set of texts for us to think with, right? I certainly don't think we all have to agree, but I think that it offers us some really important questions and ideas to think with as we continue to reflect on this.
Yeah. As you were speaking, another participant pointed out, referenced your piece, which went out this morning about which said that we don't transfer intention, I guess is the way to say it, right? If I am shooting to kill one person and I accidentally shoot another person, that is treated as manslaughter, not murder. And that also feels, that's another case where the rabbis make a decision that feels hard for us to agree with, you know?
Yeah. But
And I,
listen, if we are trying to learn Talmud to
yeah,
find only things that agree with us, we're not doing it right.
yeah.
Right? That this is a dialogue and we bring something to the dialogue, and that what learning seriously means is taking it seriously and trying to understand why smart and thoughtful people would come to that conclusion is different from saying, I'm going to read this and I'm going to agree with everything that everybody says. We can't because they disagree with each other, right? Uh, it's an impossibility.
I couldn't agree with that more. Yeah, that's part of the exercise is letting these texts challenge us, not to necessarily slavishly agree with everything on the page, which obviously the rabbis themselves don't slavishly agree with each other, but to let them challenge us and just try and increase our empathy and our thinking about positions that we might not otherwise have considered at all. So I think that's a lovely place to leave it today. Thank you for bringing these texts for us today. Thank you all of you for your comments and discussion. I loved that I saw in the discussion some folks on this chat are thinking about meeting up in real life. One of the joys of this is when we can bring people together from so many different parts of the world, but when they find each other on one small corner of the globe, that is just really lovely. So I hope that get together in Oakland, California happens. And in the meantime, I wish you all a Shabbat Shalom, and we will be in your inbox tomorrow morning, and we'll see you here next week. Take care, everybody.
Bye, everyone.